You reach for the shaker without even looking. A pinch on your eggs, a dash on your fries. You don't think about it, you don't thank it. But the real answer to why salt sits so casually on your table is far stranger than you think. For most of human history, that little white crystal was not a condiment. It was survival. It was currency. It was the difference between a body that worked and a body that shut down. Your ancestors didn't sprinkle salt. They bled for it. They walked hundreds of miles for it. Some of them died for it. Why would anyone die for something you now leave sitting on a diner table for free? Start with your own body. Every cell inside you runs on sodium. Your nerves fire because of it. Your muscles contract because of it. Your blood pressure depends on it. The physiologist Homer Smith spent decades studying how the kidney evolved specifically to hold on to salt, because early life crawled out of the ocean and lost its constant supply. Your kidneys still carry that ancient panic. They still clutch sodium like it might run out tomorrow. And for tens of thousands of years, it usually did. Humans who lived near oceans had it easy. They could scrape salt from tide pools or boil seawater down to crystals. But humans who lived inland, on grasslands, in mountains, in forests far from any coast, faced a quiet crisis. No salt meant weakness. No salt meant cramping muscles and confused minds. No salt, over time, meant death. So they searched. They found it in strange places. Deep salt licks and caves. Mineral-rich springs bubbling out of the ground. Ancient seabeds buried under mountains, left behind when oceans dried up millions of years earlier. Entire communities formed around these deposits. Entire trade routes grew out of nothing but the need for a white mineral you now barely notice. Here is where the story turns strange. In ancient Rome, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was a form of payment. Roman soldiers sometimes received part of their wages as an allowance to buy salt, called a salarium. That word is still alive today, buried inside a word you use constantly: salary. Every time you get paid, you are quietly echoing a system built around a mineral your ancestors once fought wars over. The historian Mark Kurlansky traced this connection in his sweeping account of salt's global history, showing how the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, once carried this precious cargo straight into the heart of Rome. Think about that for a second. Your paycheck is a fossil, a linguistic fossil sitting quietly inside your bank account, whispering about a mineral your ancestors once bled for. Rome wasn't alone. In West Africa, salt became so valuable that it was traded pound for pound with gold. Caravans crossed the Sahara Desert carrying massive slabs of salt mined from remote deposits like Takaza, a town built almost entirely out of salt blocks because there was nothing else nearby to build with. Merchants would arrive in cities like Timbuktu and trade their salt directly for gold dust, sometimes matching the weight exactly. Salt for gold, gold for salt. Two substances equally precious crossing paths in the desert heat. Why would anyone value a rock you can dissolve in water the same as a metal that never corrodes? Because gold was beautiful, but salt kept you alive. You cannot eat gold. You cannot preserve meat with it. You cannot survive a long winter because you own a chest of coins. But salt could stop bacteria in its tracks. It could pull moisture out of fish and meat, locking them into a form that lasted for months instead of days. Before refrigeration existed, salt was refrigeration. It was the only technology humans had to freeze time itself, at least when it came to food. This changed everything about how societies grew. Fishing villages could suddenly preserve their catch and trade it inland. Farmers could store meat through brutal winters instead of starving by February. Armies could carry preserved rations for months, letting them march farther and fight longer than any enemy who ran out of food first. Some historians argue that salt preservation quietly shaped the outcomes of entire wars, simply because one side could feed its soldiers longer than the other. The historian Robert Molthoff, who spent years documenting the industrial history of common salt, described how entire economies organized themselves around access to reliable salt sources long before anyone understood the chemistry behind why it worked. Nobody knew about sodium chloride or osmosis. They just knew that meat packed in salt didn't rot, and meat left in the open did. Salt didn't just preserve food, it preserved language itself in ways you still use without noticing. The phrase, "worth your salt," comes from exactly this era, when a person's value was quite literally measured against their salt allowance. Call someone the salt of the earth today, and you're paying them one of the oldest compliments in existence, borrowed from a time when salt represented everything decent and essential about a person's contribution. You use these phrases at dinner parties. You have no idea you're quoting the ghosts of Roman paymasters and ancient scribes. In Ethiopia, salt took on a different shape entirely. Traders cut it into hardened bars called amale, hauling them by camel across the Danakil Depression, one of the hottest and most punishing places on the planet. These bars weren't just seasoning. They functioned as actual currency, passed from hand to hand across highland markets, exchanged for grain, for livestock, for labor. A person could carry their entire fortune strapped to the back of a camel, shaped like a brick, tasting faintly of the earth it came from. Picture that for a second. Somewhere, right now, in a museum or a private collection, a slab of hardened salt sits behind glass, once worth as much as the animals that carried it. That kind of power doesn't stay ungoverned for long. Governments noticed, empires noticed. If a substance is essential for survival and difficult to produce, whoever controls it controls the people who need it. China built entire imperial monopolies around salt production as early as the Han Dynasty, taxing it so heavily that salt revenue became one of the primary ways emperors funded their armies. In France, centuries later, a salt tax called the gabelle grew so brutally unpopular that it became one of the sparks that helped ignite the French Revolution. People weren't just angry about bread. They were furious about the price of the mineral required to preserve the meager food they had. You wake up in the morning and salt your eggs without a second thought. Somewhere in history, a French villager was smuggling salt across a border at night, risking prison because the tax on it had become unbearable. The gabelle wasn't applied evenly either, which made it worse. Some regions of France were forced to buy fixed, mandatory quantities of heavily taxed salt every year, whether they needed it or not. Neighboring regions paid almost nothing. That imbalance created an entire underground economy of salt smugglers, known as fauxonniers, who risked prison or worse to move untaxed salt across internal borders. By the time revolution swept the country, salt had become a symbol of everything unfair about the old order. A tax on survival itself, enforced by an aristocracy that never had to think twice about the price of their own table. Salt roads crossed continents. The word salary hides inside your paycheck. Empires rose and fractured over grains of it. And somewhere along the way, something enormous happened. Something that quietly stripped salt of its ancient power. Refrigeration. Once humans learned to keep food cold using mechanical means instead of mineral ones, salt's greatest survival function became optional. You no longer needed it to stop your dinner from rotting. You had a refrigerator humming quietly in your kitchen, doing the job that entire trade empires once existed to do. Salt didn't disappear, it just got demoted. From lifeline to garnish, from currency to condiment, from something men died defending to something you don't even glance at while cooking dinner. Modern researchers have kept studying that ancient hunger long after the trade routes disappeared. Nutrition scientists have spent decades tracking how much sodium the human body actually needs versus how much modern diets provide, and the gap tells its own story. You need only a small fraction of what most processed food now contains, yet your brain still rewards every salty bite as if scarcity were still the default setting of the world. The craving didn't evolve to handle abundance. It evolved for a planet where salt was rare, and abundance simply never showed up on the update schedule. But here's the twist your body never got the memo on. Your brain still treats salt like it's rare. Even now, in a world where salt is cheap, abundant, and sitting in a shaker on every table in every restaurant on Earth, your taste buds still light up with pleasure the moment salt hits your tongue. That reaction isn't random. It's ancient wiring, tuned over hundreds of thousands of years by a body that once genuinely couldn't get enough of it. You crave salt today for the exact same biological reason your distant ancestors trekked across deserts for it. Your body doesn't know scarcity ended. It never got the update. Isn't it strange that abundance never fully overwrites instinct? You live in a world of practically unlimited salt, yet you still reach for the shaker like it matters. And in a sense, it still does, just not in the way it used to. It no longer decides whether your food survives the winter. It no longer decides whether your empire can outlast an enemy's siege. It decides whether your fries taste good. That's the quiet joke buried inside your kitchen cabinet. A mineral that once triggered wars, funded empires, and shaped the very word you use for your income now sits in a plastic container next to your stove, mostly ignored, occasionally knocked over, refilled without a second thought. You walk past thousands of years of desperate human effort every single time you reach for it. So tonight, when you sit down to eat and your hand drifts toward that shaker without even thinking, pause for just a second. You're not just seasoning your food, you're touching the same substance that once decided who ate and who starved, who marched and who surrendered, who got paid and who didn't. Your ancestors would find it almost unbelievable that you have as much of it as you want, sitting there completely free. You reach for the shaker without even looking, but now you know exactly what you're really holding.